1973, Elvis Presley forever sold the rights to all his immortal hits. He did it to pay off his manager's gambling debts. That same manager was taking a quarter of his kingdom. He turned his name into a soulless brand. Elvis's name was printed on lipstick, on plush guitars, on lunchboxes. But the artist himself only got the crumbs. And this was the money that bought Graceland. Today, when you buy a ticket to this house, you see a perfectly packaged American dream. But I'll tell you what foundation this mansion actually stands on. This isn't just a story about money. It's the story of how the most famous house in America was built on the greatest betrayal in music history. It's more than a house. It's an icon, carved from white stone and southern sun. Graceland. For the hundreds of thousands of people who come here every year, it's a shrine. The final stop on a long journey, the place where the American dream took physical form. They stand in line for hours under the scorching Tennessee sun, just to step inside for a few minutes, to touch the legend, to buy a piece of it in the gift shop. More than 600,000 pilgrims a year. The second most visited private home in America, second only to the White House. Here, every square inch of space is monetized. Every portrait, every gold record on the wall, every ridiculous sofa in the jungle room. It's all part of a flawlessly running machine that sells nostalgia. The ringing of cash registers here is almost as loud as the music that made this house famous. It is a triumph, undeniable and dazzling. But this facade, polished to a shine by decades of commerce, hides a very different truth. It is just a mask worn over the scars of history. Let's go back to 1977. The same house, the same gates. But the air here doesn't ring with the clicks of cameras. It's thick with grief. Instead of smiling tourists, thousands of faces distorted by sorrow. A sea of tears at the stone wall. A white hearse, slowly exiting the gates, carries the body of a king, overthrown not by enemies, but by his own demons. Newspaper headlines scream of shock and tragedy. The world couldn't believe that the 42-year-old god of rock and roll could just die here, in his own paradise. And this is the great paradox of Graceland. How did the site of one life's collapse become the launching pad for an immortal legend? How could a house that became a gilded cage, a luxurious mausoleum for a still living man, become the most successful and life-affirming symbol of the American dream? When we buy a ticket, what exactly are we seeing? A house, a museum, or a perfectly packaged tragedy? To answer that question, we need to cast aside the myths and look at the foundation. And the foundation of any great American fortune is money. The money that bought this house. Money that smells of revolution and betrayal. Before there was a house, there was capital. And that capital was born from a sound that shook the world. The sound of primal freedom, of a sexual rebellion, erupting from the guitar of a kid from Memphis. But the irony is that behind the scenes of this sonic revolution, a story of total financial control was unfolding. It all started with a single deal. November 1955. Sam Phillips, the owner of the tiny studio Sun Records, was sitting on a gold mine, but his pockets were empty. He had discovered a supernova, but his little studio didn't have the fuel to keep it burning, and so he committed an act of desperation and genius. He sold Elvis Presley's contract to the giant RCA for $35,000, an unheard-of sum for the time, a price that saved Phillips's studio from bankruptcy, but put the first leash around his star artist's neck. The very first single, Heartbreak Hotel, blew up the charts. It wasn't just a song. It was a financial flood that broke the dam and poured into RCA's coffers. But while the corporation was counting its millions in sales, a new player appeared on the scene. A man with no past, a former carnival barker who called himself Colonel Tom Parker. He wasn't a musician. He was a market maker. He didn't see an artist in Elvis. He saw a brand. His contract was a masterpiece of cynicism. 25% commission on everything, from records, from concerts, from movies. In an era when 10% was considered robbery, Parker demanded a quarter of the kingdom, and he got it. In 1956, he pulled off a deal that would define the future of pop culture, mass merchandising. Elvis's name was everywhere, on lunchboxes, on lipstick, on plush guitars. This stream of merchandise brought in $22 million in a single year. From this golden river, Elvis himself only received trickles. And against the backdrop of these astronomical sums, the price of Graceland, $102,500, looks like a drop in the ocean, like petty cash. This house, which would become a symbol of his limitless success, was bought with money that was the byproduct of his exploitation. But the apotheosis of this financial drama would come later. In 1973, Colonel Parker, mired in gambling debts in Vegas, needed a large sum of money, fast, and he found a solution. He convinced a tired, sick, drug-addled Elvis to sign a single document, to sell the rights to all his greatest hits recorded before '73, forever. For a paltry few $1 million, he lost the royalties to the songs that made him immortal. He sold his past to pay off his manager's debts. This is the money that bought Graceland. It wasn't just the earnings of a genius. It was capital built on the desperate deal of one studio, on the brilliant greed of one manager, and on the tragic trust of one artist. Every dollar invested in these walls was minted from his talent, but polished by someone else's avarice. Graceland was bought, but freedom was sold. 1957. A 22-year-old kid, with the adrenaline of conquering a nation still coursing through his veins, drives down the most respectable street in Memphis. He is the living embodiment of rebellion. His music is a seismic fault line that separated the new generation from the old world. And then, this rebel stops his Cadillac. He's not looking at a modern villa, not at a den of glass and concrete. He's looking at it, a colonial revival mansion. At first glance, it's a paradox. Why would the king of rock and roll want a house that looks like a country club or a senator's residence? Why would he want these symmetrical columns, this austere facade, this aura of conservative respectability? To understand this choice, you have to understand what he was really rebelling against. Not against the music of his fathers, but against their poverty. The colonial revival style isn't just architecture. In the American South of the 50s, it's a statement. It was the language of power, the code of respectability, spoken by generations of Southern aristocrats, planters, bankers, lawyers. This was old money, and Elvis was a boy from a two-room shack built by his father. To the establishment he was conquering, he remained a hillbilly with a guitar, an upstart. And buying this house wasn't just a real estate transaction. It was an invasion. Every one of these columns was paid for by the rebellion of teenagers. Every room bought with notes they considered indecent. He wasn't just buying a house. He was buying his place in a world that despised him. He took their ultimate symbol of status and paid for it in cash. It was the loudest and most audacious chord of his career. But there was another, deeper reason, a personal one. In his memory still lived the vow he made to his mother, Gladys, during years of desperate poverty. A vow that one day he would buy her the most beautiful house, and they would never have to move again. Graceland isn't a designer's choice. It's the fulfillment of a son's promise, a monument to love built with the money of a revolution. And in this act of conquest, there is one subtle, brilliant touch. He didn't change the name. The house was already called Graceland. Someone else in his place would have torn down that name, replacing it with something flashy, like Elvis Palace. But he kept it. In this gesture lies the entire essence of his victory. He doesn't destroy the old world. He absorbs it. He makes it serve him. He's saying, your history, your traditions, your symbols, now they're mine. He bought respectability. He seized the symbol. But he failed to consider one thing. Symbols attract pilgrims, and pilgrims know no boundaries. He had entered his paradise, but he didn't count on the whole world following him, not as guests, as an army. From the very first days, Graceland ceased to be a home and became a besieged territory. The love of millions, which had bought him this mansion, now came to claim its share. Fans set up a permanent camp at the gates. They lived there, slept in their cars, waited for hours, days, weeks, just to catch a fleeting glimpse of his silhouette in a window. They trampled the immaculate lawn, turning it into a muddy mess. They tore leaves from the trees and picked up stones from the driveway to take home as sacred relics. This wasn't adoration. It was consumption. His fame was devouring his peace. The dream of a quiet family nest for his mother, of a safe harbor, was crumbling before his very eyes. Elvis's inner world, his fragile sanctuary from the pressures of the world, demanded physical protection. And so, a decision was made. The first great decision that changed Graceland forever. The battle for boundaries had begun. He would build a wall. Stone by stone, workers erected a barrier of pink Tennessee fieldstone. This was not an ugly concrete barrier. It was beautiful in its own way, almost elegant, but its purpose was cruel. This wall spoke in a simple, clear language. Stop. Beyond this point is my territory. Every cent of those $11,000 was paid for silence, for the right to walk in his own yard without feeling thousands of hungry eyes upon him. This wall was the first and most important alteration of Graceland. It physically transformed an open southern mansion into a closed fortress. It became the stone embodiment of his growing paranoia, a boundary separating the world of the king from the world of mere mortals. This was not a battle against nature or his neighbors. It was a battle against the byproduct of his own genius. But a wall is a paradox. It doesn't repel a crowd. It organizes it. It gives them a focal point for their energy. The gates, built into this wall, became an altar. The wall itself, a canvas, immediately covered in writings, declarations of love, and pleas. He had walled himself off from the world, but with this gesture, he only intensified its obsession. The walls were raised, the fortress took shape, but inside, it was empty and echoing. And now, he had to fill this emptiness with living people. The walls protected him from outsiders, but they didn't save him from loneliness. Elvis Presley, the most desired man on the planet, was terrified of being alone. And to fill the vacuum inside his new fortress, he began to build something more complex than stone walls. He began to build his own court. People came to live at Graceland. Relatives, old high school friends, guys from his neighborhood, all those who knew him before he became the king. The press dubbed them the Memphis Mafia, but they weren't gangsters. They were his personal army, his human shield. Their job was simply to be there, around the clock. They lived in the house, ate at his table, drove his cars. They were entirely on his payroll. At first glance, it was an act of incredible generosity. a boy who had escaped poverty, pulling everyone he cared about up with him. But behind this facade hid a more complex, almost feudal system. Graceland had turned into a microstate with its own laws, its own currency, and its own absolute monarch. And the main currency here was none other than Elvis's attention. The struggle for proximity to the throne was constant and brutal. Who would go to the movies with him tonight? Who would sit next to him during his all-night vigils? To whom would he gift a new Cadillac, and whom would he banish for a careless word? It was a battle for loyalty, and Elvis was its unrivaled master. He gave out lavish gifts, but demanded absolute devotion in return. They were his eyes and ears, his buffer, cutting off any criticism, any unpleasant news from the outside world. But this system came at a price. By surrounding himself with people who were completely dependent on him, he deprived himself of the ability to hear the word no. Every wish, every whim, every caprice was instantly fulfilled. They indulged his weaknesses, protected him from the consequences of his actions, and isolated him from reality. This army, created for protection, imperceptibly turned into an army of enablers. The Memphis Mafia was a living extension of the stone wall. If the wall shielded his body from the world, these people shielded his mind. Graceland became a hermetically sealed bubble, where reality bent to the will of one man. Now that the borders were secure and the court was assembled, a new battle began. A battle with the house itself, with its respectable soul, which had to be torn out and replaced with his own. He had conquered the house from the outside. Now he had to conquer it from within. Elvis Presley entered into battle with the legacy of old money, with the spirit of moderation and good taste that permeated these walls. He didn't hire fashionable designers from New York. He didn't read architectural magazines. He simply dictated his will, turning every room into a page from his own psychogram. A total overhaul began. The respectable interior he inherited from the previous owners was ruthlessly destroyed. In its place, a world was born, woven from boyish fantasies, Hollywood kitsch, and royal excess. Take the jungle room. It wasn't just a nod to the trend of Polynesian style. It was something more. It was the creation of a primitive, wild sanctuary inside a civilized house. A waterfall built into a stone wall, carved wooden furniture upholstered in fake fur, and everywhere, that poisonous green shag carpet, reminiscent of thick moss. Here, in this artificial jungle, the king could cast off his mantle and become a tribal chief. This room was bought in 30 minutes, in a single impulsive raid on a furniture store. This is not design. This is instinct. Or the billiard room. He ordered not only the walls, but also the ceiling to be draped. 350 meters of pleated cotton fabric, as if the interior had been transformed into a giant theater curtain. It took 10 days to bring this whim to life. It was a theater of the absurd, where every game of pool became a scene from a Baroque opera. And his television room in the basement. It had 3 TV sets. Not because he was a multimedia pioneer, but because he heard that President Lyndon Johnson watched the news on 3 screens simultaneously. If the president does it, then the king must do it too. This wasn't a pursuit of information, it was an imitation of power. Every object here is a statement. The white grand piano, originally black, was repainted to match the new, dazzling white living room. Mirrored ceilings, gilded finishes, velvet. Everything screamed of excess, that the rules no longer applied. Elvis was waging a war against norms, against the very idea that it's just not done. He could wake up in the middle of the night, decide he was tired of a room's color, and by morning, it would already be repainted. Graceland was not a static museum. It was a living, constantly changing organism that mutated according to its master's mood. It was his personal universe, his life-sized dollhouse. And into this dollhouse, into this fortress of kitsch and egocentrism, he would soon bring his living doll. Amidst this man-made chaos, this kingdom of velvet and gold leaf, Elvis was missing one most important detail. He needed a center. He needed a family. And he decided to build one, just as he built everything else in his life, to his own design and under his complete control. In 1963, she was brought to Graceland, a 17-year-old Priscilla Presley, a teenager just torn from her normal life in Germany and placed in the very heart of the storm. Her arrival was not just a romantic gesture. It was a desperate attempt by Elvis to build normalcy within a completely abnormal world. He wanted a wife, a home, a family, all the trappings of that very American dream he so diligently embodied. But Graceland wasn't a home, it was a stage, and Priscilla was cast in the leading female role. For her, the place instantly became what it truly was, a golden cage. She lived in a luxury she couldn't have dreamed of, but this luxury came at a price. Her life was subject to his rhythm. She slept during the day and was awake at night. Her style of dress, her hairstyle, her makeup, everything was shaped by his dictates. He molded her into his ideal woman, just as he had molded the interiors of his home. She was his most beautiful and most living, decorative object. Graceland, which for him was a fortress and a refuge, became for her a labyrinth of loneliness. Surrounded by the Memphis mafia, she was the only woman in a man's kingdom where the king made the laws. Her personality, her desires, her dreams dissolved in the shadow of his gigantic ego. On February 1st, 1968, Lisa Marie was born. This was meant to be the culmination of the perfect family project. The arrival of a child was an attempt to breathe a real, living soul into these walls, which were already beginning to feel like a cold mausoleum. For a time, it worked. A child's laughter filled the rooms, and toys appeared among the gilded trinkets. It seemed the battle for normalcy had been won. But Graceland was too powerful an organism, too egocentric a universe. It did not tolerate competition. A normal family life could not exist under an absolute monarchy. A house built as a monument to one man could not become a nest for two. A cage remained a cage, even if another bird appeared inside it. And the walls that were supposed to protect this family slowly began to suffocate it. The higher he rose, the more shadows he cast. The fame that had been his shield was becoming his curse. Every new gold record on the wall, every new sold-out stadium, only amplified the hum in his head. A hum of voices, desires, demands. The walls of Graceland could hold back bodies, but not gazes. He felt them on him constantly. And so Graceland began to look back. The fortress grew eyes. Wires snaked through its hallway veins, and surveillance camera lenses were embedded in its walls. Elvis turned his home into a personal panopticon. From his office, he could see who was approaching the gates, who was walking down the hallways. He became the supreme warden of his own prison. This total control was supposed to bring peace, but it only fed his paranoia. Now the invisible enemy could be anywhere, not just outside, but inside too. And then the invisible enemy found a voice. In 1970, paranoia became reality. The FBI received information about a planned kidnapping of Elvis Presley. This was no longer the hysterical love of fans trying to climb a wall for a souvenir. This was the cold calculation of professional criminals. The threat was deemed serious. Federal agents placed Graceland under surveillance. Security was tightened. This incident became the point of no return. It broke something inside Elvis. The world was definitively split into here and there. The safe, controlled territory of Graceland and the hostile jungle beyond its borders. The fortress, built to protect him from adoration, now had to protect him from hatred and greed. He became a prisoner of his own security system. Every step he took outside his home was planned like a military operation. Every stranger seemed like a potential threat. And Graceland, his sanctuary, became ever more hermetic, ever more suffocating. He had built the perfect defense against the outside world. Every entrance was monitored, every perimeter guarded. But he overlooked the cardinal rule of any siege. The most terrifying threat isn't the one trying to break in, but the one that slowly devours you from within. Behind the fortress walls, in the quiet of its rooms, another, invisible battle was unfolding. A battle with numbers. Graceland, his greatest trophy, his symbol of absolute success, had turned into a ravenous monster, devouring money. The numbers were merciless. $500,000 a year. That's how much it cost to maintain this paradise in the mid-70s. Taxes, utilities, the salaries of the Memphis mafia, security, cooks, gardeners, endless interior redesigns at the master's every whim. This house breathed money, and that was just the running costs. The king's appetites were growing. He bought cars by the dozen, giving Cadillacs to friends and complete strangers. His personal fleet numbered up to 30 vehicles. And then he needed the sky. He bought an airplane, a former Delta Airlines liner, and spent hundreds of thousands to turn it into a flying palace with gold-plated seatbelt buckles. He named it the Lisa Marie. Where was the money for all this carefree, extravagant life to come from? There was only one answer: the stage. And here, the drama reaches its peak. We see two realities existing in parallel. The first is Graceland. Nighttime golf cart rides across perfectly manicured lawns, the laughter of friends by the pool, generosity that knows no bounds, a world where money seems to materialize out of thin air. And the second reality is Las Vegas. Stuffy, smoke-filled hotel venues, the blinding glare of spotlights hiding the beads of sweat on his face, a body clad in heavy, jewel-encrusted jumpsuits, a voice that could still work magic, but behind which you could already hear a mortal exhaustion. Hundreds of grueling concerts, 2 shows a night, night after night. Every new trinket at Graceland was paid for with his health. Every salary paid to his entourage was earned by the voice he was shredding on stage. Every minute of peace within the walls of his fortress was bought with hours of humiliating struggle against his own body, which he spurred on with a cocktail of medications just to be able to walk out to the audience. Graceland was literally devouring its creator. The home that was supposed to be the reward for his success became the reason that success turned into hard labor. He had built himself a paradise, and now he was forced to work in hell just to pay for its upkeep. He was cornered. The Hollywood studios had become an assembly line for soulless movie soundtracks. The road on tour became a road to Calvary. His music, the very force that had built this house, was now almost inaccessible to him, buried under tons of commercial obligations and other people's expectations. And then, in the middle of his golden cage, he committed an act of creative rebellion. He decided to bring the music home. Literally. His gaze fell upon the strangest, most personal space in Graceland, the jungle room. This absurd fantasy with its artificial waterfall and green shag carpet. It was his playroom, his man cave, his escapist paradise. It was the place he chose for his last stand for the right to be an artist. He called RCA. He wasn't going to Nashville. He wasn't flying to Los Angeles. The studio would come to him. And it did. in the form of mobile recording equipment, which technicians hauled through the house and set up right in the middle of the artificial vines and stone walls. For a few weeks in February and October of 1976, the Jungle Room became the most unusual recording studio in history. This was an act of returning to his roots. There were no producers in stiff suits, no pressure of corporate schedules. There was only him, his musicians, his home, and his voice. Surrounded by this wild, almost primeval decor, he sang of pain, of loss, of loneliness. His voice, tired and cracked, found a new, tragic depth here. The songs recorded in the Jungle Room became his last great songs, his artistic testament. He transformed the symbol of his escapism, a room created to flee from reality, into a place for the most honest and brutal encounter with it. He proved that even in the heart of his fortress, surrounded by walls and ghosts, he was still a musician. It was a brief but furious flash of light. He had won back his music. He made it sound on his own territory and on his own terms. But this was a battle for his art. And ahead of him lay one more, final battle. The battle for his soul. Within the walls of the Jungle Room, primal rhythms raged. But within the walls of his soul, a different storm was brewing. Deafening fame brought a crushing silence. Great wealth brought spiritual poverty. He had conquered the world, but lost himself. And so the man who had everything began a desperate search for what money can't buy. He began to search for peace. In 1964, long before the darkest days, he attempted to build something entirely different at Graceland. Not a room for entertainment, not a status symbol. He built a place for silence, a meditation garden. It was his personal Zen corner. A small, secluded space with a white pergola, a circular fountain, and statues of angels. Here, far from the noise and bustle of the house, he tried to find answers. He read spiritual books, studied Eastern religions, and talked with friends about the meaning of life and reincarnation. This garden was meant to be his sanctuary, a place where the king could take off his crown and just be a man searching for his path. This whole scene is filled with a tragic, almost unbearable irony. He was looking for a way to understand life here, but it was this very place that fate chose to be the final stop on his earthly journey. The space created for the search for eternal meaning would become the site of his eternal rest. This structure, the quietest and most modest in all of Graceland, turned out to be the most prophetic. He was building a gazebo for contemplation, but he was actually laying the foundation for his own necropolis. He was seeking spiritual salvation for himself here, but he ended up creating a pilgrimage site for millions. The meditation garden was his last attempt to build something intangible, an attempt to look beyond fame and money. But fate had other plans. It took his most spiritual creation and turned it into the most material point on the map, a grave, a place where the myth ends and the stone begins. 1973. The judge's gavel in the courtroom struck louder than any drum roll. The divorce from Priscilla became official. And in that moment, Graceland lost its center of gravity. The last thread connecting him to the illusion of a normal life was severed. Project Perfect Family had failed. The woman he had brought here as a teenager and tried to mold in his own image had chosen freedom. She had left the golden cage. And the house, deprived of its queen, began to rapidly transform from a family nest into a bachelor's den, filled with the ghosts of the past and the hangers-on of the present. Elvis's inner world was crumbling, and the house, like a faithful mirror, reflected this decay. The atmosphere grew heavier. The nightly vigils, longer and more senseless, the laughter of friends was increasingly replaced by tense silence. Graceland became the perfect backdrop for self-destruction. There was no one here who could say, "Enough." There was no one who dared to challenge his demons. The walls he had so carefully erected to protect himself from the outside world now served a new, sinister function. They hid his slow fading from the eyes of those who might have been able to help him. The footage from those years is merciless. We see how his body changes, a swollen face, a tired, lifeless gaze. The legendary energy that could ignite a stadium now barely allowed him to climb the stairs. The fortress didn't just fail to save him. It became the perfect environment for his illness. It isolated him from reality, from responsibility, from salvation. He won the battle for his borders. He won the battle for loyalty. He even won his final battle for music. But the main battle, the battle with himself, he was losing. And his magnificent home, his greatest achievement, became a silent witness to this defeat. The walls, built to protect a life, now guarded a slow, well-organized death. A day at Graceland began when the sun was already setting. The outside world lived by its own laws, but inside the fortress, time flowed differently. It obeyed the rhythm of one man's insomnia. Waking in the afternoon, the first steps down the stairs, into a world that awaited only his command. The kitchen ran 24 hours a day, ready at any moment to create his favorite peanut butter, banana, and bacon sandwich, a calorie bomb that became as much a symbol of his excess as the gold-plated piano. The night was his time. The night transformed Graceland into his personal amusement park. He could rent out a local movie theater for the entire night to watch the latest releases with his friends, or hold impromptu concerts at the piano, remembering the old gospels his mother used to sing, or race around the dark grounds on golf carts, playing tag under the stars. It was a life of absolute power. His every word was law. But this power was an illusion, because the true masters of this house were becoming his demons. Flashes of rage, when he might blast a tiresome television with his pistol, gave way to fits of almost childish generosity, when he would give diamond rings to his bodyguards. He was a child king, capricious and lonely, surrounded by an entourage that had become his jailers. They were everywhere, these accomplices in his decline, people whose well-being depended on his illness. They brought him little white envelopes. Inside, prescription drugs, his fuel and his poison, sleeping pills to fall asleep, stimulants to wake up, painkillers just to exist. Graceland, his sanctuary, became the perfect safe house for this slow-motion suicide. The walls reliably hid the truth from prying eyes. In this one-man theater, everyone else was merely an extra. He created a world where he was the absolute center of the universe, but in the end, he found himself in complete isolation. He could buy anything, but he couldn't buy one thing: a reason to wake up tomorrow. Graceland ceased to be a home. It became a stage on which, every day, or rather, every night, the tragedy of a man who had lost touch with reality was played out. August 16th, 1977. On this day, the music stopped. Inside Graceland, at its very heart, on the second forbidden floor, a catastrophe occurred. But we don't see it. We hear it, in the deafening silence that suddenly fell. Panic shatters the house's sleepy atmosphere. Frantic movement. Faces contorted with fear. Then, the wail of an ambulance siren, cutting through the midday Memphis heat. The vehicle enters the famous gates and disappears behind the wall, hiding the drama from the world's eyes. But not for long. The news spreads like wildfire, first in whispers, then in shouts from television screens. The king was dead. In an instant, Graceland transformed from a private residence, from a mythical fortress, into a place of national mourning. Thousands of people flooded its walls, turning the front lawn into a sea of tears and flowers. The fortress had fallen. It now belonged to them, his subjects. But behind the scenes of this global tragedy, another, more prosaic drama was unfolding. A drama of numbers. When lawyers and accountants unsealed the king's financial will, they discovered a shocking truth. The coffers were nearly empty. Years of thoughtless generosity, predatory management, and exorbitant expenses had taken their toll. The inheritance amounted to only a few $1,000,000. And Graceland, his greatest monument, continued to bleed money. $500,000 a year went to its upkeep. Taxes, security, staff. The house, built on millions, now threatened to devour the last crumbs of the estate. The verdict from the bank advisors was as cold and logical as the strike of a gavel. Sell. The fate of Graceland hung by a thread. The palace that had become a symbol of the American dream was at risk of being auctioned off for debt. Its rooms could be sold off piece by piece, its walls torn down, and the land sold for development. It seemed the story was over. The king was dead. His kingdom was on the verge of bankruptcy. But no one had accounted for one person, someone who knew this house not as a shrine, but as a golden cage, and it was she who would decide its fate. She enters the stage, Priscilla Presley. The woman who once fled this fortress to save herself now returned to save its legacy. In her hands lay the fate of not just a house, but an entire myth. And she makes a decision that many considered madness. She refuses to sell. Instead, she travels. She visits other historic home museums, studying their business models. She sees how the stories of other great Americans are turned into successful enterprises. And a plan is born, daring, risky, almost heretical. She will open Graceland to the public. She will turn a private tragedy into a public attraction. She hires a team of managers and invests the last $500,000 of her daughter's inheritance into the project. It was a gamble. All in. If the plan had failed, nothing would have been left of the estate. June 7th, 1982. The gates of Graceland open, but this time, not for mourners, for tourists. The first 3,024 people buy a $5 ticket and step inside. They walk through the same rooms where the drama unfolded, but now it is not a home. It is a museum. The success wasn't just stunning, it was instantaneous. Within the very first month of operation, Graceland completely recouped the entire investment. Priscilla didn't just save the house, she created a financial empire. The myth turned out to be far more profitable than the reality. And so here we are again, in the present day. We see again these sun-drenched columns and crowds of tourists. But now their gazes seem different. They are not just looking at rooms and furniture. They are looking at the physical embodiment of the great American paradox, a dizzying rise from poverty, absolute power within one's own world, and the tragic price paid for that dream. The upper floor is forever closed to the public. The Holy of Holies, where the tragedy occurred, keeps its secret. This is the last bastion of private life in the most public house in America. Graceland survived. It survived because it ceased to be one man's fortress and became a temple for millions. It immortalized not only its creator's triumph, but also his isolation. It turned his pain into a perpetual business, and the main question remains unanswered. When we stand here, in this immaculately preserved mausoleum, what are we really worshiping? The dream, or just its mummified, incredibly high price? And so Graceland, built as a fortress to protect one life, became a temple immortalizing its downfall. Its walls, once erected against the world, now invite that world inside to sell it a perfectly packaged legend of rebellion, loneliness, and the dazzling price of the American dream. And as we gaze upon this flawless facade, paying for the right to touch the myth, are we saving a legacy, or are we becoming accomplices in its final, most profitable transaction? This story has no simple answer, and that's why your voice is especially important. Share your thoughts in the comments. Did this house become a victory or a defeat? Support our channel with a subscription and a like so we can continue to ask uncomfortable questions about great myths.